No! Don't touch that!
Tell me why.
She slapped a $200,000 cup of tea out of a Mafia boss's hand, and in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, 4 loaded guns decided whether she'd live to explain why. If you believe the ones who notice danger deserve to be believed, not silenced, smash that like button right now. Subscribe if you're Team Amara, because in a world full of poisoners hiding behind smiles, we need more people brave enough to slap the glass away. Only liars and cowards keep scrolling. Rain smeared the neon skyline of Seoul into wet brushstrokes against the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. 31 floors up, the world looked small and manageable, which was exactly how Kang Min-jae liked it. Manageable, predictable, under control. He didn't know yet that control was about to become a very expensive illusion. The restaurant, Cheongdam Sky, didn't appear on any tourist map. It didn't need to. The kind of people who ate there already knew where it was, and the kind of people who didn't know weren't the kind of people who mattered. Min-jae sat at his usual table, back to the wall, eyes on the door, the way men in his profession learned to sit before they learned to shave. 4 bodyguards flanked the room like furniture nobody dared touch. His business partner for the evening, a shipping magnate with a smile too white to be trusted, had just excused himself to the restroom, leaving Min-jae alone with his tea and his thoughts, which was precisely when a stranger's mistake becomes a dead man's last decision. Amara Johnson had been in Seoul for 14 months, long enough to know the difference between a customer who tipped well and a customer who tipped in silence and fear. Long enough to memorize the smell of jasmine tea, the way some people memorize a favorite song. She balanced trays for a business degree she was paying for one exhausting shift at a time, and she had perfected the particular skill of being invisible in rooms full of powerful, dangerous men. Invisibility had kept her safe. Tonight, it was about to make her impossible to ignore. She lifted the porcelain cup from the tray, steam curling upward, and something in her chest went cold before her mind caught up with why. A smell. Faint. Wrong. Bitter beneath the floral sweetness, like a lie hiding behind a compliment. Her father's voice moved through her memory before she could stop it. Almonds mean cyanide, baby. Not the fruit kind. The kind that stops hearts. He used to say it while teaching her to read lab reports at the kitchen table, back when she still believed a warehouse fire could just be a warehouse fire. Min-jae's fingers closed around the cup. Amara didn't think. She moved. The slap sent porcelain exploding across imported Italian marble. Tea spreading like a confession nobody wanted to make. For one full second, the restaurant froze. Forks suspended. Conversations dying. Mid-syllable. The kind of silence that has weight and temperature. Then 4 guns rose in perfect, terrible unison. Amara had exactly 1 sentence left to live, and she used it wisely. "Don't arrest me," she said, voice shaking, but spine straight. "Test it first." Min-jae looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle piece that doesn't belong to the puzzle he thought he was solving. Nobody touched him. Nobody interrupted him. And yet, here was a waitress who'd done both, offering him logic instead of apologies. "Test it," he repeated, almost amused. Almost curious. He lifted 2 fingers. His guards lowered their weapons a fraction, not out of mercy, but out of professional interest in how this would end. 9 minutes later, in a private lab attached to the kitchen most guests never knew existed, the results confirmed what Amara's instincts had already screamed. Cyanide. Professionally disguised. Patiently planned. Someone in that restaurant had built a murder weapon delicate enough to be mistaken for jasmine. And somewhere in the building, that someone was still smiling, still pouring wine, still pretending to be exactly who they claimed to be, which is the oldest trick every villain in Seoul had ever learned to perfect. And if you've ever worked for someone who smiled to your face while planning your downfall behind it, hit subscribe right now, because only manipulators and cowards scroll past a woman who refuses to stay silent. Min-jae rose from his chair, tea forgotten, danger forgotten, staring at the trembling waitress who had just rewritten the rules of his very controlled life. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "And how did you know?" Amara opened her mouth to answer, and that was the exact moment the restaurant's lights flickered, died, and plunged all 31 floors into sudden, breathless dark. The dark didn't last long enough to be merciful. Emergency lighting flickered on in amber pulses, casting the restaurant in the color of a warning nobody had bothered to read in time. Screams rose and died quickly, swallowed by the particular discipline of people trained never to draw attention to themselves. Min Jae's bodyguards formed a wall around him instantly, 4 bodies moving as one organism, weapons drawn, eyes scanning exits that had suddenly become suspects. Amara stayed exactly where she was. Moving felt like an invitation to be shot. "Everyone on the floor!" one guard barked, and the wealthiest people in Seoul dropped to imported marble like obedient children, forgetting entirely that minutes ago they'd been discussing yacht acquisitions. Min Jae's eyes never left Amara. "You," he said, voice low enough that it barely qualified as sound. "Stay close to me." It wasn't a request. She'd learned enough about men like him in 14 months of serving their wine to understand that requests and orders wore the same clothes, but never the same weight. The backup generator kicked in 90 seconds later, restoring full light, restoring the illusion that everything was fine, restoring the particular Seoul specialty of pretending nothing had happened at all. But Min Jae wasn't pretending. He was calculating, the way men calculate when their empire has just shown them a crack they didn't know existed. Power failure, his head of security reported, jogging over, breathless in a way trained men rarely allowed themselves to be. Not the building's grid. Someone cut it manually. Basement junction box. Someone, Min Jae repeated, the word landing like a verdict. Someone who knew exactly which box to cut, in a building most guests don't even know has a basement. Amara felt the pieces sliding into place before he said it aloud. The cold clarity of understanding a puzzle designed by someone patient and terrifyingly organized. "The blackout wasn't an accident," she said quietly. "It was a backup plan." Min Jae turned to her fully now, something shifting behind his eyes. Not quite respect, not yet, but the early architecture of it. "Say that again." "If the tea failed," Amara continued, thinking aloud, piecing together instinct and memory the way her father used to at that kitchen table she still dreamed about. They needed a second option. Chaos, confusion, a window where anything could happen and no camera could prove who did it. The restaurant manager, sweating, pale, already halfway to confessing before anyone asked him a single question, was escorted past them in handcuffs, his eyes darting everywhere except toward Min Jae's face. Guilty men rarely made eye contact. They learned somewhere that eye contact was a door, and doors could be walked through by people looking for truth. But Amara noticed something else, something small. The kitchen pass door, swinging slightly, though no wind moved through a sealed 31st floor restaurant. Someone had gone through it recently, someone who hadn't waited around to be arrested. She grabbed Min Jae's sleeve without thinking, an act of familiarity that made 2 of his bodyguards tense, like she'd pulled a weapon instead of fabric. "Someone left," she said. "Through there, during the blackout." Min Jae's jaw tightened. He nodded once toward his security chief, who peeled off toward the kitchen with 2 men, weapons drawn, radios crackling. For a moment, in the amber then white confusion of the restaurant, Min Jae studied Amara the way collectors study rare things they hadn't been shopping for. A waitress with a poisoner's instincts, a stranger who noticed doors that swung without wind. Either an extraordinary coincidence or something else entirely. And Min Jae did not believe in extraordinary coincidences. He'd built an empire on the principle that everything had a cause, a hand behind it, a reason hiding in plain sight. "Who exactly are you, Amora Johnson?" he asked, using her full name, though she'd never given it to him, which only confirmed what she already suspected. Men like him always knew more than they let on. Before she could answer, his security chief's voice cracked through the radio, breathless, urgent, carrying the particular tremor of a man who had just found something he wished he hadn't. "Sir, you need to see the kitchen pass, now." Min Jae's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. A drop in temperature, a tightening of the air itself. "Show me," he said, and pulled Amara along with him, not as a hostage, not quite as a guest, but as something new and unnamed between the two. A witness he wasn't ready to let out of his sight. They stepped through the swinging door together, into a hallway lit by flickering emergency bulbs, and stopped cold. Painted across the stainless steel wall, in what could only be blood, 5 words waited for them like a promise. "You should have drunk the tea." The words dripped down stainless steel like they were still deciding whether to be a warning or a promise. You should have drunk the tea. Nobody spoke. Even the emergency bulbs seemed to hesitate, flickering slower, as though the building itself understood it had just witnessed a threat too personal to broadcast. Min Jae stared at the message with the stillness of a man doing math in his head, counting enemies, counting exits, counting the exact number of people who'd had access to that kitchen in the last hour. Test it, Amara said quietly, nodding at the wall. It might not be blood. His security chief already had gloves on, already dabbing a swab against the lettering, already radioing the same lab that had saved Min Jae's life 20 minutes earlier. Efficiency, Amara realized, was the only language Fear spoke fluently in this building. Pig's blood, the chief confirmed 2 minutes later, reading off his phone. Theatrical, not evidence. A message. A message, Min Jae repeated. Means they wanted me to survive long enough to read it. Amara felt the shape of it before she could name it. They're not finished. This isn't revenge for a failed poisoning. This is an introduction. Min Jae turned to her again, and this time the look wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to recognition, the way a man looks at a mirror he didn't expect to find in a stranger's face. You keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Understanding things faster than the people I pay to understand them. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't quite a threat either. It existed in the narrow, dangerous space between the two, which Amara was beginning to suspect was the only space Kang Min-jae ever occupied. The restaurant manager, still cuffed, still pale as spilled milk, was dragged back for a second round of questioning, not by police, who hadn't been permitted anywhere near this floor, but by Min-jae himself, whose interrogation style apparently required no raised voice at all, only the specific silence of a man who had all night and nothing to lose. Who paid you? Min-jae asked. I don't know his face, the manager stammered. A courier. Cash. Instructions folded inside a napkin. I swear on my daughter. Don't, Min-jae interrupted, almost gently. Invoke people you love while lying to me. It insults both of us. The manager broke fully then, confessing to a meeting behind the restaurant 3 nights earlier, a figure in a rain-soaked coat who never removed his hood, who spoke in a voice deliberately roughened, who paid triple the going rate for a job simple men rarely got offered twice. No name, no face. Only an instruction, chillingly specific. Make sure he drinks it before the second course. Someone had studied Min-jae's habits, his schedule, his order. Someone patient enough to wait for the exact configuration of comfort and routine that makes powerful men careless. Amara's mind snagged on one detail, small and sharp as a splinter. The second course, she said slowly. That's suspiciously precise for a stranger. Min-jae's eyes sharpened. Meaning? Meaning whoever planned this knew your dining habits well enough to know your rhythm. That's not surveillance from a distance. That's proximity. That's someone close. The room went quiet in a new way. Not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of a man realizing the knife might already be inside the house rather than at the gate. Min-jae's gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the private booth reserved exclusively for family, currently empty, currently far too convenient in its emptiness. His cousin hadn't shown up tonight. First time in 3 years. Before Min-jae could chase that thought further, his phone buzzed once against the marble counter. A message from a blocked number, arriving with the casual cruelty of something designed to be seen at the worst possible moment. One photo. Grainy. Time-stamped an hour earlier. It showed Amara, mid-shift, unaware, walking home from the restaurant 3 nights prior. Proof that whoever orchestrated tonight's poisoning hadn't chosen her table by accident. They had chosen her long before she ever lifted that cup. Min-jae turned the phone toward her slowly, watching her face for the exact moment recognition became fear. They knew who you were, he said, before you knew who I was. Amara stared at the photograph of herself, walking alone in the rain, followed by someone patient enough to wait, and felt the ground shift beneath a life she thought was ordinary. Then this was never about you, she whispered. It was about me. The photograph stayed on the screen between them, rain blurred and cruel. Proof that Amara's ordinary Tuesday night shift had been someone's calculated stage all along. That's not possible, she said. though her voice betrayed the fact that she was already reconsidering everything she believed about her own life. Nobody follows waitresses. Nobody plans around waitresses. Somebody planned around you specifically, Min Jae said, pocketing the phone. Which means you were never a bystander tonight. You were a variable someone accounted for. The words settled over her like cold water. 3 years of grief. 3 years of believing her father's death was a closed case. Nobody wanted opened. And now, a stranger's phone was suggesting the opposite. That she'd been watched, cataloged, positioned. I need you to tell me about your father, Min Jae said, quieter now. The interrogation softened into something almost careful. Not the version you tell strangers. The real one. Amara hesitated. Trust wasn't a currency she spent easily, and certainly not with men who owned restaurants nobody could find on a map. But something about the wreckage around them, shattered porcelain, pig's blood drying on steel, a photograph proving she'd been hunted before she ever picked up that cup, made secrecy feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. He worked for a food safety watchdog, she said. Investigated supply chain contamination. Big companies mostly. The kind that could make problems disappear if the right people got paid enough to look away. Her hands trembled slightly, memory doing what fear hadn't managed. 3 years ago, he was investigating a shipment that never should have cleared customs. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Warehouse fire. Case closed before it even opened. Min Jae's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker of recognition he clearly hadn't expected to feel. Which warehouse? Incheon district. Storage facility near the docks. She watched his face carefully. Why does that matter to you? He didn't answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession. Finally, he said, because I know that warehouse. My organization used it for storage years before I took control of operations, before I inherited a business already built on decisions I never made and debts I never signed for. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Amara's feet. You're telling me your empire is connected to my father's death? I'm telling you, Min Jae said carefully, each word measured like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold, that I need to look at files I haven't looked at in years. And I'm telling you that if what I suspect is true, tonight wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the continuation of something that started long before either of us sat at this table. Amara felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite rage, but the specific ache of finally being handed a thread after 3 years of grasping at smoke. I want to see those files. That's not how this works. Then make it how this works, she snapped, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. You said someone followed me. Someone chose me before I ever touched that cup. That means I'm already inside whatever this is, whether you let me see the files or not. The only question is whether I see them as your ally or as another loose end somebody decides to clean up. Min Jae studied her for a long moment, and Amara watched something shift behind his composure. Respect, wary and unfamiliar, settling into a man who wasn't used to being challenged by people he could have removed from a room with a single gesture. Tomorrow, he said finally. My private office. Bring nothing. Trust no one you haven't already trusted for years. That's a short list. Then it's an easy rule to follow. Before she could respond, his security chief reappeared, face tight with the particular urgency of a man who'd rather deliver bad news quickly than let it fester. Sir, the blocked number. We traced the signal bounce. It pinged off a tower 2 blocks from here 15 minutes ago. They're still close, Min Jae said, already moving toward the elevator, pulling Amara along in his wake without asking permission, as though her safety had quietly become his responsibility the moment her name appeared in someone else's surveillance photo. Close enough to watch us right now, Amara said, scanning the rain-streaked windows, the darkened rooftops across the street, wondering how many patient eyes were somewhere out there in the storm. The elevator doors opened, and taped to the inside panel, waiting exactly where only someone with restaurant access could have placed it, was a second photograph. This one, far older, yellowed at the edges, showing a younger Amara standing beside her father at what looked unmistakably like the Incheon warehouse, months before the fire that was supposed to have buried the truth for good. Amara's knees nearly buckled. The photograph was old, the edges soft with handling. The colors faded into the particular yellow of a memory nobody was supposed to keep. In it, she stood beside her father outside a warehouse she barely remembered visiting, both of them squinting against sunlight, both of them smiling in the specific way people smile when they don't yet know they're being watched. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I was 15. I went there once. Once. Once was enough," Min-jae said grimly, lifting the photograph carefully by its edge, studying the back for markings, dates, anything that might explain how a moment from her childhood had ended up taped inside his private elevator. "Somebody's been building a file on you since before your father died. This isn't surveillance from tonight. This is surveillance with a decade of patience behind it." The elevator doors slid shut, sealing them into a small steel box that suddenly felt like the least safe place in Seoul. "Why?" Amara said, voice cracking on the word. "Would anyone care about a teenager visiting her dad at work?" Min-jae's jaw tightened. "Because your father wasn't just investigating a shipment. He was building a case. And cases need witnesses. Maybe you saw something back then that you don't even remember seeing." The thought landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward into every corner of her memory. She tried to recall that day. The smell of salt and diesel. The sound of her father's voice explaining shipping manifests she hadn't cared about at 15. A man in a dark coat standing near the loading dock who'd stared a beat too long before her father steered her away. "There was someone there," she said slowly, the memory surfacing like something long buried finally clawing free. "A man. My father got tense the moment he saw him. He made me wait in the car after that." "Would you recognize him now?" "I don't know. I barely remember his face. Just the coat and the way he stood, like he owned the ground he was standing on." Min-jae exhaled slowly, and for the first time that night, Amara saw something close to exhaustion cross his features. The specific fatigue of a man realizing his empire had roots tangled in more graves than he'd ever bothered to count. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto a private garage, rain hissing against skylights 3 stories up, a convoy of black cars waiting with the engines already running, drivers who'd clearly been trained to expect chaos and treat it as Tuesday. "Where are we going?" Amara asked. "Somewhere they haven't mapped yet," Min-jae said, guiding her toward the second car, his hand hovering near her back without quite touching her, a gesture of protection dressed carefully as professionalism. "You're not safe at your apartment tonight. Possibly not safe there again." "I have a life," she said, though even as she said it, the word felt smaller than it had that morning. "Classes. Rent. A job I apparently just quit by throwing tea across a restaurant floor." "You have a life someone has been quietly rewriting for a decade," Min-jae corrected. "The question isn't whether you go home tonight. The question is, who's waiting there if you do?" She wanted to argue. She wanted, desperately, to insist that her life was hers, ordinary, self-made, untouched by warehouses and dark coats and men who paid couriers and folded napkins. But the photograph in Min-jae's hand said otherwise, and somewhere beneath her fear, a colder, more familiar feeling was rising to take its place. Anger. Her father had spent his life chasing truths powerful men wanted buried, and he died for it while the world called it an accident. If someone had been circling her since she was 15, watching, waiting, filing her away like a loose thread they intended to cut eventually, then Amara was done being invisible. "Fine," she said, sliding into the car beside him, spine straight, chin lifted the same way it had been when she'd faced down 4 loaded guns an hour earlier. "But I'm not hiding. I'm not disappearing into some safe house to wait this out while you handle it. Whatever this is, it started with my father, and I intend to finish it." Min-jae looked at her for a long moment, rain drumming against the windows, the city sliding past in smeared gold and red. "That," he said quietly, "is the most dangerous thing you've said all night." The car pulled out into the storm, and behind them, unseen in the shadows of the parking garage, a figure in a dark coat lowered a phone, having captured every second of their departure, already typing a message to someone, waiting 3 warehouses and 1 buried truth away. The man in the dark coat typed 3 words before disappearing into the rain. "They're together now." 20 minutes later, in a penthouse Amara hadn't known existed until the elevator doors opened onto floor-to-ceiling glass and a city glittering like scattered coins below. Min-jae spread 3 folders across a steel table. Each one was thin. Each one, Amara understood instantly, had been thinned deliberately. Pages removed, names redacted, truths edited by people who'd had 3 years to decide what the world was allowed to know. "This is everything my organization has on the Incheon warehouse," Min-jae said. "It isn't much, which tells you something on its own." Amara opened the first folder with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Shipping manifests, dates, a cargo classification code that meant nothing to her and, judging by the tightness in Min-jae's jaw, meant something troubling to him. "Pharmaceutical precursors," he said, tapping the code. "Legal to import. Illegal in the quantities logged here. Someone was moving more than the paperwork admitted. And my father found out." "Your father," Min-jae said, "found out and did what watchdogs do. He filed a report. 2 weeks before he died, he requested an inspection warrant. He slid a final page across the table. A warrant application, denied, stamped with a signature Amara didn't recognize, but that made Min-jae go very still. Denied by a customs official who, according to this, no longer works for customs. He works for me. Or he did, until 8 months ago, when he resigned without explanation and vanished." Amara stared at the signature until the letters blurred. "You're telling me the person who buried the warrant that could have saved my father's life was on your payroll?" "I'm telling you," Min-jae said, voice low with something that sounded almost like shame, "that I inherited an organization I didn't build, full of decisions I didn't make, and I'm only now learning how deep those decisions go." The admission cost him something visible, a crack in the composure he'd worn like armor since the moment she'd slapped that cup from his hand. For the first time, Amara saw not a mafia boss, but a man drowning slightly under the weight of a throne he'd never asked to inherit. "Where is he now?" The customs official. "That's what I intend to find out tonight." Min-jae's phone buzzed, and he read the message with the particular stillness of a man absorbing bad news without letting it show. "My security chief traced tonight's phone signal further. It didn't just ping near the restaurant. It's pinged from the same location 3 times this month." He turned the screen toward her. A map. A red marker, hovering over a dot Amara recognized instantly, cold recognition spreading through her chest like frost. The Incheon docks. The same warehouse from the photograph. "They're still using it," she breathed. 3 years later, and they're still operating out of the exact place that killed my father. "Which means," Min-jae said, standing, already reaching for his coat, "either they're arrogant enough to believe nobody would ever look there again, or they're confident enough that whoever might look wouldn't survive long enough to report it." "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You don't get to decide that." Amara stood too, matching his height with the sheer force of her refusal to be managed. "This is my father's case. My life they've been filing away for a decade. I have spent 3 years being told to let it go, to accept the official story, to grieve quietly and stop asking questions that made powerful men uncomfortable. I'm done being quiet." Min-jae studied her, rain still drying in her hair, exhaustion and fury sitting together in her eyes, in a combination he clearly hadn't encountered often. Someone who refused fear, even when fear was the only rational response available. "If you come," he said finally, "you follow my instructions exactly. No hesitation. No improvising." The last person who improvised near that warehouse ended up in a fire investigators were paid to misclassify. "Understood?" He nodded once, sharp and final, and reached for a second coat, offering it to her not as a gesture of chivalry, but as armor for whatever waited at the docks. As she took it, her fingers brushed his, and for one unguarded second, something passed between them that had nothing to do with warehouses or warrants. A recognition, unwilling and inconvenient, of 2 people who'd both spent years surviving in worlds that demanded they trust no one. Outside, thunder rolled over Seoul's skyline, and somewhere across the city, in a warehouse that had already buried one investigator's truth, the man in the dark coat was watching the same red dot on a different screen, waiting patiently for the 2 people foolish enough to come looking. Rain turned the Incheon docks into a maze of black water and rusted steel. Shipping containers stacked like tombstones for a truth someone had tried to bury 3 years too early. Min-jae's convoy killed its headlights half a mile out, gliding the last stretch in darkness. The kind of practiced silence that came from men who'd done this before and intended to walk away from it again. "Warehouse 17, Min-jae murmured, checking the old file against the corroded numbers stenciled on steel. Same one. Amara's pulse hammered louder than the rain. 3 years of unanswered questions had led her here. Not to a courtroom, not to an apology, but to a condemned building where her father's death had been quietly filed away as bad luck. Inside, the warehouse smelled exactly like she remembered. Salt, rust, and something chemical underneath that made her stomach turn. Crates of pharmaceutical precursors sat stacked in neat, deniable rows. Exactly the kind of operation that thrived because everyone above it agreed not to look too closely. A voice emerged from the shadows before they'd taken 10 steps. Kang Min Jae, I wondered how long it would take you to remember this place existed. The man who stepped into the weak emergency light wore no coat this time, no hood, nothing to hide behind, because he no longer needed to. Min Jae's former customs official, the one who denied the warrant, the one who'd been on the payroll long enough to know exactly how the Empire's silence worked, and had apparently decided 8 months ago that silence was more profitable when it served him instead of Min Jae. You poisoned my tea, Min Jae said, voice flat and cold as the rain outside. I poisoned an inconvenience, the man corrected. You inherited a business built on decisions men like me made for you. I simply got tired of being paid in gratitude instead of power. Killing you would have solved that. He nodded toward Amara, something like admiration flickering across his face. Her father almost solved it 3 years too early. I made sure that mistake wouldn't repeat itself. Almost. You murdered him? Amara said, stepping forward despite Min Jae's hand tightening briefly on her arm. Called it an accident. Let his own daughter believe he burned to death because of faulty wiring. Faulty wiring is so much easier to accept than the truth, the man said, almost gently, the cruelty of it landing harder for how calmly he delivered it. People prefer easy answers. You, unfortunately, never did. He gestured, and from the shadows behind the crates, 4 armed men emerged, the private security of a man who'd spent years learning exactly how empires like Min Jae's protected themselves, and had built his own smaller, angrier version of the same machine. What he hadn't accounted for was Min Jae's men already stationed on the catwalks above, weapons trained since before the conversation began. The exchange, when it came, was fast, controlled, entirely one-sided. The particular efficiency of an organization that had survived decades by never entering a room without owning every exit first. The former official ended up on his knees on the concrete, gun kicked away, the arrogance draining out of him in real time, as he realized his rebellion had lasted exactly as long as it took Min Jae to remember he still had loyal men left. You have one question, Min Jae said, crouching to his level. Make it count. But it was Amara who stepped forward instead. 3 years of grief compressed into a single, steady sentence. Why my father, specifically, out of everyone who could have found that warrant? The man looked up at her, and for the first time, something like genuine regret crossed his face. Not enough to soften what he'd done, but enough to answer honestly. Because he was the only one who wouldn't take the money. Everyone else did. He just kept asking questions. It wasn't justice. It wasn't the courtroom confession she'd dreamed about for 3 years. But it was the truth, finally, spoken aloud in the same warehouse where it had been buried. And sometimes, Amara realized, the truth had to be enough to start healing from, even when it couldn't undo the damage already done. Police sirens, real ones this time, arranged quietly by Min Jae through channels that owed him favors older than Amara's entire life, echoed through the rain as the man was taken into custody, evidence in hand. Warrant records finally reopened under a name that couldn't be buried twice. 6 months later, Amara stood in a courtroom, not as a witness hiding in shadows, but as the daughter who had finally forced the truth into daylight. Min Jae sat in the gallery, present but silent, watching a woman who'd once slapped a poisoned cup from his hand, now dismantle the lie that had defined her grief. Outside the courthouse, rain had finally stopped. Amara turned to him, exhaustion and something warmer mixing in her expression. You never did thank me properly for the tea. Min Jae almost smiled. A rare, unpracticed thing. I was saving it for when you didn't need saving anymore. She looked at him, at the empire he was quietly rebuilding into something his father's mistakes hadn't tainted, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to imagine a future that wasn't shaped entirely by someone else's silence. Good, she said. Because I'm just getting started.